Network's live stream. Or good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Rain Network's live stream where we discuss various geopolitical topics with our analyst team. And today I am with our Asia Pacific analyst, Nate Fischler, and we are going to be discussing a recent breakthrough in Japanese South Korean relations. So, Nate, let's just start off with a background here. Japan obviously has a wartime history with South Korea. How has that affected their relations, for the past 70, 80 years?
Yeah, actually very profoundly. So good morning, Ryan. It's nice to be here. Yes, so the legacy of World War II and before, actually. So Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula 1910 to 1945 under a particularly brutal military regime. The various crimes against humanity, and this still resonates to this day, mostly because Tokyo is not willing to acknowledge historic wrongdoing or guilt to the extent that Seoul desires, or much at all, frankly. And this continues to be a sticking point in South Korean-Japanese relations on a level that is quite constraining, quite profound. The very notion of rapprochement with Japan in South Korea is a highly controversial domestic political issue. A lot of personal feelings, a lot of emotions around it. The current opposition, the Liberal Democratic Party, is very much opposed to these initiatives to get closer to Japan. So that historical legacy plays a huge part. And we might get into this later, but they have achieved a breakthrough, but this will be a long-term constraint on and an upper limit on the cooperation between the two.
Well, it's interesting. It's coming on the backdrop of increased worry about China's rise and potentially China's, this possible invasion of Taiwan sometime in the future, or confrontation between the United States and China over Taiwan. And they're both U.S. allies, and so it can seem strange at times. Where I want to say it was maybe 5-10 years ago, where there was talk of actual war between them over a handful of islands. And how that animosity can run so deeply that it can create that instability within the U.S. Pacific Alliance system. What do you think is the effect of China's rise and the potential of China's militarism, with an invasion of Taiwan? Do you think that that's a major driver of bringing Japan and South Korea closer together?
Absolutely. Both of these countries are deeply concerned, worried about the rising Chinese maritime power, military power more broadly, the aggressive way they push their claims, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and Japan's more worried about that. That is a major driver. I'd say that for these two countries in particular, maybe a larger driver is actually North Korea, with their missile launches and their saber rattling, which is pretty frequent. So one thing we actually got out of the summit that we should lay that groundwork too. Two heads of state completed a 3-day summit in Tokyo yesterday. One of the things they agreed on was a military intelligence sharing pact that had been negotiated before, but now they're committing to implementing it. So they have different capabilities and capacities when they survey North Korea, for example. And so the combined capacity to monitor North Korea's missile program is definitely a benefit to them, because they each have their blind spots in their own analyses of the North Korean threat. So that's more immediate, definitely for Seoul. They're more concerned about North Korea, also China. Japan that order might be reversed, but both of these countries are deeply concerning to both Tokyo and Seoul, and that is driving them together.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about what are those blind spots towards North Korea that the two have?
Sure. So to be completely honest here, so the technical details are a bit elusive to me, but it's my understanding that there are different capacities that Japan and South Korea have that they deploy in order to gather intelligence and understand the technology. So just speaking to that, I don't know the details, unfortunately, but they have different strengths and weaknesses in their intelligence with respect to North Korea, and so combining the two capacities will shore up some of those weaknesses that they have.
So what about some of the kind of the business and economic implications of this breakthrough? What barriers are there to trade and to doing business in either place that are being facilitated or being eased by this kind of a diplomatic upgrade?
Yeah, sure. And this actually kind of ties back to the historical grievance element. So in 2019, Japan applied trade restrictions to materials needed to make smartphones and excuse me, LED screens, semiconductors. Applied all of these restrictions on South Korea in retaliation for a Supreme Court ruling, the South Korean Supreme Court ruling, which found that Japanese companies are liable to compensate victims of forced labor during that 1910 1945 occupation. Some of those folks are still alive, of course. And then Japan, of course, did not like this decision at all, and they decided to retaliate by slapping these trade restrictions on South Korea. South Korea responded by complaining to the World Trade Organization. So, but both of those things have been resolved. Japan is removing the trade restrictions on South Korea on semiconductor materials and LED screens and smartphones, the high-tech stuff that they need. And also, following the summit, you had business leaders from the two countries in a sort of round two or follow-up to the heads of state meeting, pledged to work more closely on semiconductors and these more high-tech materials that are in great demand right now. So they're going to shore up their supply chain, have tighter high-tech collaboration, and of course, the movement of goods will be smoother between the two going forward.
Right, and this is kind of a good example for us to talk about the way that the RAIN network approaches the methodology of geopolitics. And we've got one of our big pillars of geopolitics is history, and World War II was nearly a century ago now, but it continues to have ramifications for South Korean Japanese relations, which include impacts on business and economics. And that's a notable thing to consider when we think about how states behave. These two states have been leaning on this historical pillar in such a way for such a long time that it's taken a while for their governments to kind of have a slight ideological shift to de-emphasize that pillar and start to emphasize the economic and the security pillar, of course. So the mutual concern over North Korea, the mutual concern over China. So I think this is an interesting example of one of those places where old stories continue to haunt current relations. Where do you see it going next? How far? You said that there was kind of upper limits to this. What are those upper limits?
Sure. Well, a lot depends on the South Korean domestic political situation I was describing a bit before. So you have the conservatives are in office now. Yoon, the president of South Korea, is very interested, and he's made it clear from day one. One of his goals is rapprochement with Japan, and this is the prerogative of his party, the Conservative Party. On the other hand, you have the Democratic Party, who are liberal. They're very critical of all of these initiatives. They accuse him of selling out the country. That is shameful, that is the worst diplomatic initiative in the country's history, and so on and so forth. Therefore, you have Yoon's term. He can potentially stay in office until 2027. If he does, depending on who's around, which way the winds are blowing, the trajectory looks good. So beyond Yoon's term, though, if the Democrats get back into power, there's a decent possibility, a good chance that they might backtrack on some of these things. And so that's something to look for in sort of the longer term, is how will the Korean public react to this? Is the Korean public amicable to rapprochement with Japan? And of course, to go back to those historical issues a little bit, of course, the legacy of World War II, everybody knows about it. You can compare it to Germany. Germany has done a lot to take responsibility for its past, open museums, they teach it in their schools. There's a lot of shame in Germany about it. In Japan, this is not the case. They don't really teach it. They don't really acknowledge it. When the Koreans complain about it, they say, "Why are you complaining? This is the past." And their navy still flies the Imperial Japan Rising Sun flag. This makes it hard for the two navies to coordinate, because to the Koreans, this flag is similar to the German swastika of the Nazis. So understandably so, the Koreans think we don't want to work with somebody flying this symbol, and then the Japanese are just not responsive to these grievances very much at all. So it's a different situation, and so a lot will depend on the Korean situation, the domestic political situation, and then Japan's willingness to actually acknowledge some of this very controversial history, which they've not been willing to do very much, and they probably won't be willing to do much. They definitely won't be willing to do as much as Seoul wants. I do think that they'll probably make some small concessions in that respect going forward, but not what Seoul is looking for, and definitely not enough to satisfy the opposition.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't know if there's any questions from the audience right now. We can give a few seconds to see if anybody has anything specifically that they'd like to ask. Um, Otherwise, if you are interested in reading further on this, Nate, you've just put out, or you're about to put out a piece on this very subject, and that's an area where you can continue to read on the results of the summit, as well as learning more about how we view, Japanese South Korean relations, as well as the confrontation between the United States and China, and how it's affecting and driving different behavior from various allies throughout the East, the West Pacific, I should say. Well, if you want to learn any more, please visit our website at www.rainnetwork.com. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ryan.